understand what is happening in Ukraine today, we must throw away liberal illusions about international law and morality and look at the situation through the lens of realism. And what we see in early 2026 is a classic example of how a great power, in this case Russia, is fighting a war of attrition against a neighbor it views as a threat to its existence because it wants to join Western structures. My position has always been clear. The United States and its European allies are mostly responsible for this crisis because they lured Ukraine down a false path, promising it membership in NATO and turning it into a Western fortress right on Russia's doorstep. Now, we are seeing the tragic results of this policy. The situation around Kharkiv, a city with a population of 1.5 million, is the clearest sign of where this conflict is going. When we talk about the possibility of Russian troops surrounding Kharkiv, we must understand Moscow's strategic logic. Russia does not just want to seize territory for the sake of territory. Its goal is the demilitarization of Ukraine and creating a situation where Kyiv can never threaten Russian interests again. Kharkiv is only 30 kilometers, about 19 miles from the border. For Russia, this is not just a city, it is a strategic hub. Controlling it allows them to create a deep buffer zone and secure their own border regions, like Belgorod. If we analyze the state of the front on February 2nd, 2026, it becomes obvious that the balance of power has shifted decisively in Moscow's favor. In the war of attrition that we are watching, the deciding factors are population size, industrial power, and the will to keep fighting. Russia has the advantage in all three areas. It has many more people it can mobilize. Its defense industry is running at full capacity, producing shells and equipment in amounts that the West either cannot or does not want to supply. And the Russian leadership has an unshakable resolve to see this through to the end. Look at the events in the Donetsk region, especially around Pokrovsk. Capturing 79 square kilometers in a short time might seem small to an average person, but in the context of trench warfare, it is a serious success. The Russian army is slowly but surely grinding down the Ukrainian defense. When you lose the hubs like Pokrovsk, your logistics collapse, the depth of your defense shrinks, and Ukrainian generals have to make impossible choices, either leave positions and retreat or risk their best units being surrounded and destroyed. The tactic of small groups filtering through, which the Russians are using near Chasiv Yar, is extremely effective against an army that is critically short on manpower. Ukraine is forced to rely on drones because it simply does not have enough soldiers to fill the trenches. But drones cannot hold territory. People hold territory, and Ukraine is running out of them. Western media, like the New York Times, are finally starting to admit what realists have said from the very beginning. Ukraine is in an extremely difficult position. The shortage of troops is not a problem that can be solved by sending a few dozen tanks or even F-16 jets. This is a fundamental crisis of population and organization. Russia, on the other hand, has adapted its economy, did not collapse under the weight of sanctions. As many in Washington predicted, instead, it shifted to a war footing. When you are dealing with a state that believes it is fighting for its survival, sanctions rarely work as expected. Returning to the issue of Kharkiv, it is worth noting that the use of even empty gas pipelines by Russian troops for hidden movement in Kupiansk shows a high level of tactical flexibility and smarts. This is no longer the army that made mistakes in early 2022. This is a war machine hardened in battle that has learned to fight in modern conditions. Ukraine, meanwhile, is constantly just putting out fires, what is called a game of whack-a-mole. As soon as they stop a breakthrough in one place, Russian pressure increases in another. This is the classic strategy of stretching the enemy's forces until the defense snaps at its weakest link. The prediction that Russia might seize a significant part of northeastern Ukraine, including Kharkiv, is becoming more realistic as Western support begins to weaken. And here we come to the role of Europe. European powers, France, Germany, Great Britain, are in a state of deep internal crisis. Their governments are weak, their economies are stagnant, and their populations are getting tired of endlessly funding a conflict with no end in sight. Zelensky can criticize European leaders in Davos all he wants for being slow, but the reality is that Europe has neither the industrial potential nor the political will to replace the US as Ukraine's main sponsor. Europe lived under the American security umbrella for a long time and forgot how to think in terms of hard power. Now that the US is starting to shift its attention to China, Europe finds itself in a trap. It cannot protect Ukraine alone, but ideological pride prevents it from admitting defeat. However, facts on the ground are more important than ideology. The new EU loan for Ukraine is just a drop in the ocean. It is not enough even to keep the state running, let alone win a war against a power like Russia. political fragmentation inside Europe, and the rise of populist parties that are skeptical about supporting Kiev all play into Moscow's hands. But the most interesting and important aspect of this geopolitical drama is the change in the US position. In Washington, there are pragmatists sitting who understand that the main threat to American dominance is China, not Russia, spending colossal resources and draining their arsenals in Ukraine. While Beijing builds up power in the Pacific Ocean, is strategic madness. Therefore, we see signs of a warming between Washington and Moscow, the Pentagon's new defense strategy. Calling Russia a manageable threat is a clear signal. The US wants to stabilize relations with the Kremlin to free its hands for the confrontation with China. Extending the New START treaty until February 5th, 2026, is a concrete step in this direction. This does not mean the US and Russia will become friends. No, they remain rivals. But this is a pragmatic rivalry where both sides are interested in lowering the risks of direct nuclear confrontation. Washington is starting to understand that Russia is not going to leave Ukraine and that defeating it on the battlefield using Ukrainian hands is impossible without the risk of starting World War III. Consequently, the only rational way out for the Americans is to push Kiev toward negotiations on Moscow's terms. So what does this mean for the future of Ukraine? So the picture looks grim if current trends continue. Ukraine will come out of this conflict as a rump state. The loss of Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions is already a done deal, which many admit behind closed doors in Western capitals. But it might not end there. If Kyiv persists in refusing to negotiate, it could lose even more. Parts of the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, which Russia needs to secure the land corridor to Crimea, and possibly Kharkiv and surrounding territories. Russia already controls about 19% of Ukraine's territory. This is a huge area, comparable to the American state of Ohio, losing another 20%. And the Donetsk region and southern regions would be a catastrophe for the Ukrainian economy. Kharkiv, in this context, is a key industrial and educational hub. Its loss would strip Ukraine of a significant part of its remaining potential. After the war, Ukraine will be a country with destroyed infrastructure, massive foreign debt, and millions of refugees who are unlikely to return. Of course, various options for security guarantees for what remains of Ukraine are being discussed. Macron and other European leaders talk about placing NATO troops or creating a coalition of the willing. But let's be honest, are France or Germany ready to send their soldiers to die for Kharkiv or Pokrovsk? The answer is no. Russia knows this and therefore continues to push. Moscow understands that time is on its side. The longer the war lasts, the weaker Ukraine becomes, and the less desire the West has to support it. The tragedy of Ukraine is that it was turned into a tool in the struggle of great powers. The US used Ukraine to weaken Russia, but Russia turned out to be tougher than Washington thought. Now that US interests are changing, Ukraine might simply be left alone with its problems, offered to accept the loss of territory for the sake of an illusory peace. This is the cruel logic of realism. But international politics has always been and remains a cruel game where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian territory and oil depots are a tactic of desperation. They have a media effect, but they do not change the situation on the front line. They cannot stop the advance of Russian tanks or artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions. Moreover, such attacks only strengthen the resolve of Russian society and give the Kremlin an excuse for even harder strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. This is a vicious circle of escalation in which Ukraine has fewer resources for recovery than Russia. Ultimately, we must admit that the project of turning Ukraine into a Western outpost on the border with Russia has failed. It was a strategic mistake of epic scale. Now the question is not whether Ukraine will win. It can no longer win in the traditional sense of the word. The question is how much more territory it will lose and how many more lives will be sacrificed for unreachable goals. Kharkiv could become the next major loss. And if that happens, it will be the final confirmation that the balance of power in Eastern Europe has changed forever. Russia has demonstrated that it is ready to pay a huge price for its security interests. The US has demonstrated that its support has limits, especially when a more serious challenge in the form of China looms on the horizon, and Europe has demonstrated its inability to be an independent geopolitical player. In this triangle, Ukraine ended up squeezed, and its future looks extremely uncertain. The defeat of Kyiv in this war of attrition seems almost inevitable unless there is some radical change in the foreign policy of the great powers, which cannot be expected in the current conditions. Reflecting on the future, we must understand that even if the fire stops tomorrow, the consequences of this conflict will be felt for decades. We will see a new security architecture in Europe. where Russia will have to be given a place that it was refused after the end of the Cold War. Ukraine, most likely, will turn into a buffer state, stripped of a significant part of its territories and industrial potential. This is a high price for the miscalculations of the elites in Kyiv and Washington, who ignored the basic laws of geopolitics and the security interests of a great power. Look at the dynamic of the Russian troops' advance. This is not a blitzkrieg. It is the methodical destruction of the enemy's military potential. Russia uses its superiority and firepower to clear the path and then move forward. Ukraine, conversely, is forced to save every shell and every piece of equipment. In such conditions, any attempt at a counteroffensive is doomed to fail. As we saw in 2023, Ukraine is now in deep defense, and its main task is simply to prevent a total collapse of the front. But how long can you hold the defense when your reserves are exhausted and your allies are starting to look away? The US always acts based on its national interests. Right now, its interest is China. Russia, for them, is a problem that needs to be minimized, not destroyed at any cost. That is exactly why we see the slow turn in Washington toward a more pragmatic approach. Ukraine was useful as a means of wearing down Russia, but now it is becoming a burden that distracts resources from the Pacific region. For Zelensky and his government, this is a nightmare. But for a realist, it was predictable. Great powers always use small states for their own interests and then discard them when the strategic context changes. As for Europe, its inability to act unanimously and decisively only highlights its decline. While Macron makes loud speeches about European autonomy, real power and resources remain with the US. Without American logistics, intelligence, and funding, Europe is not capable of supporting Ukraine even at the current level. And internal social and economic problems only speed up the process of Europe distancing itself from this conflict. Populism, inflation, the energy crisis, all these are factors that force European voters to ask the question, why are we spending billions on Ukraine when our own healthcare and education systems are falling into decay? In this situation, Russia feels confident. It sees the cracks in the Western alliance and understands that it just needs to keep doing what it is doing. Every captured kilometer in the Donetsk region, every advance toward Kharkiv is another nail in the coffin of Western ambitions in Ukraine. Moscow is not ready for compromise because it believes it is winning, and facts on the ground confirm it is right. When you control the initiative and possess superior resources, you have no incentive to make concessions. The future map of Ukraine will likely look like a shrunken version of what we knew before. The loss of Kharkiv would be the symbolic and practical end of Ukraine as a major industrial power. It will be an agrarian country fully dependent on Western handouts and living in constant fear of its eastern neighbor. Such is the reality to which years of ignoring Russia's interests and expanding NATO to the east have led us. We must be honest. The international system is anarchy, where there is no higher authority capable of protecting small states. The only way to ensure security is to consider the interests of great powers and not turn into their staging ground. Against competitors, Ukraine made this mistake, and now it is paying the highest price for it. And my analysis has always been built on the fact that Russia will not allow Ukraine to become a member of NATO. It would rather destroy Ukraine than allow that, and today we see how this scenario is being realized before our eyes. Looking at the outlook for 2026, one can say with confidence that the war of attrition has reached its critical point. Ukraine faces an existential choice, but it has almost no good options left. Either agree to a humiliating peace with the loss of huge territories, or continue to fight until the total collapse of statehood. And judging by how the US and Russia are starting to make deals behind China's back, the first option is becoming increasingly inevitable. Ultimately, history will judge who is right. But if you ask me, I will say that we are watching the logical result of Western arrogance and the underestimation of Russia's resolve. Kharkiv, Pokrovsk, Chasiv, Yar. These are not just names on a map. These are stages in the process of rearranging the world order in which liberal dreams are shattering against the hard reality of power and national interests. Thus, to sum up, we see that Russia is methodically achieving its goals, using its advantage in resources and will. The West, led by the US, is starting to realize the futility of its efforts to inflict a strategic defeat on Moscow and is switching to other priorities. Ukraine finds itself in a situation where it has to pay the bill for someone else's game. This is a tragedy that could have been avoided if leaders in Washington and Brussels had listened to the voice of realism decades ago. Now we can only watch how this defeat will be formalized and what borders will be established in the new Eastern Europe. One thing can be said for sure, the world will never be the same again. And Ukraine will occupy a much more modest place in it than Western politicians promised it in 2014 or 2022. Realism teaches us to look at the world as it is, not as we would like to see it. And the current reality for Ukraine and its supporters is extremely harsh. Peace will come, not when justice triumphs. In international politics, there is no such concept. It will come when a new balance of power is reached, and this balance today is shifting toward Moscow and Beijing. While the US tries to save the remains of its influence by making pragmatic deals where they can no longer win, Ukraine is just one of the chess pieces in this big game. And unfortunately for it, its role in this match is coming to an end. The capture of Kharkiv by Russia, if it happens, will be the final confirmation that NATO failed to protect its partner. It will be a signal to all other countries that hope for Western security guarantees. Real power, not empty promises, defines borders and sovereignty, and until the West understands this, it will continue to make strategic mistakes, like the Ukrainian one. We need to understand that Russia will not stop until it is sure that Ukraine will never again become a threat. And if for this, it needs to capture even more cities and turn Ukraine into a non-viable buffer state, Moscow will do it. It has both the means and the will for this. The West, conversely, demonstrates fatigue and a lack of clear strategy. In this asymmetry of resolve lies the key to understanding the outcome of the conflict. Ukraine fights bravely, but in big geopolitics, bravery alone is not enough when a great power with almost limitless resources and a nuclear arsenal is playing against you. In the end, we have a situation where real politics takes precedence. Over ideological slogans, the US adapts, Russia advances, and Ukraine loses the future it was promised. This is a cruel lesson for everyone who believes that morality is more important than power in international relations. And Kharkiv, standing on the threshold of great upheavals, is a living reminder of this truth. When we look at the numbers, we see that Russia produces 3 times more artillery shells than all Western countries combined for Ukraine's needs. How can one expect Ukraine to win in such a situation? It is a mathematical impossibility. War is not only the spirit of soldiers, it is primarily logistics and production. Russia has won the competition with the West in this regard. The US understands this, and that is why they are changing course. They do not want to be tied to a sinking ship when they have more important business in the Taiwan Strait. To understand why this process has become practically irreversible, we must realize that a war of attrition is not a series of spectacular battles shown in movies, but a giant industrial and demographic calculator. And this calculator today is working against Kiev with relentless speed. When we analyze the situation in February 2026, we see that the Ukrainian army has faced what I call a triple crisis. A crisis of manpower, a crisis of material means, and, most importantly, a crisis of strategic perspective. Let's start with manpower because this is the most fundamental element of any war. You can supply as many systems or Abrams tanks as you want, but if you do not have trained, motivated, and physically strong soldiers to hold the defense lines, this equipment turns into a pile of metal. The US and Europe hoped for a long time that Western technological superiority would compensate for Russia's numerical advantage. But this was a deep delusion. In a conflict of this intensity, quantity has a quality all its own. Ukraine has already conducted several waves of mobilization, and each subsequent one was harder than the previous. We see how the average age of a Ukrainian soldier on the front has passed 43 years. This is not an army that can conduct large-scale offensive operations. This is an army trying to survive in trenches under constant fire. Russia, on the other hand, has a population that is almost 5 times larger than Ukraine's, if you count those who left the country. Moscow was able to create a system of continuous replenishment of its troops without conducting a new official wave of mobilization, using financial incentives and a huge internal resource. When one side runs out of people and the other does not, the outcome is predetermined. It is pure math. In 2026, we see how Ukrainian units in critical sectors of the front, such as Kupiansk or the outskirts of Donetsk, are staffed at only 40 or 50% of their intended numbers. This means soldiers cannot go on rotation. They become exhausted physically and psychologically, which leads to local collapses of the front. The second crisis is material. The Western press likes to write that the Russian economy is a gas station with rockets. But this gas station has demonstrated amazing resilience. While the US spent months on political debates in Congress about allocating the next aid package, Russian factories worked in 3 shifts. Today, Russia produces about 4.5 million artillery shells a year, the entire collective West. Including the industrial power of the US and Europe, barely reaches 2 million for supplies to Ukraine. in an artillery war where 70 or even 80% of casualties are caused specifically by shell fragments. Such a ratio of forces is a death sentence for the defending side. Ukraine has become 100% dependent on external supplies. It does not have its own significant defense industry capable of meeting the needs of the front. Every time the political climate in Washington changes, or farmers' protests begin in Europe, the flow of weapons slows down. For Russia, supplying the army is a matter of internal management. Putin moved the country to war rails, and now this machine is rolling forward, gathering momentum. Even if the US sharply increases supplies now, it will take years to restore parity, years which Kyiv simply does not have. Now let's move to the third most important crisis, the strategic one. What is Ukraine's goal? Zelensky declares a return to the 1990-91 borders. From a realist's point of view, this is not strategy. This is fantasy. Ukraine does not have the resources to capture Crimea or Donbass. Any attempt to attack prepared Russian positions results in colossal losses that Kyiv cannot afford. Thus, Kyiv's strategic goal is unreachable. On the other hand, what is Russia's goal? Putin was extremely clear. Neutral status for Ukraine, demilitarization, and recognition of territorial realities. Unlike Ukrainian goals, Russian goals are backed by real power and advancement on the ground. When the goals of one country are realistic and the others are not, the country with unrealistic goals inevitably loses. We see how Western elites are starting to realize this. In the US, voices are sounding more often that a way out of this dead end must be found. And this way out, as I've already said, will be found at the expense of Ukraine's interests. Washington is not going to sacrifice its global position to help Kyiv get back every square meter of land. For the US, Ukraine is a tool to contain Russia, but the tool should not be more expensive than the goal itself. If supporting Ukraine starts to threaten the stability of the American economy or distracts too many resources from China, the US will simply cut its losses. This is what they did in Vietnam, this is what they did in Afghanistan, and this is what they will do in Ukraine. Look at the geopolitical map of the world in early 2026. The main challenge to American hegemony is the alliance between China and Russia. The US made the greatest strategic mistake in its history by pushing Moscow into Beijing's arms. Now, people are sitting in Washington trying to fix the situation, and they understand that the only way to weaken this alliance is to stabilize the situation in Europe. And stabilization in Europe is impossible without considering Russia's security interests. This means Ukraine will have to agree to territorial concessions and give up ambitions to join NATO. Many say this is unfair, but international politics has never been about justice. It is about power and survival. Ukraine trusted Western promises and made a fatal mistake by becoming an outpost against the neighbor that is 10 times stronger economically and 3 times larger by population. This is a classic example of what I call the tragedy of great power politics. A small state gets dragged into a struggle of titans and ends up destroyed. The situation around Kharkiv in this context is not just a military operation, it is a signal. Russia is showing that it can expand the zone of control until Kyiv surrenders or until the West forces it to sit at the MAP negotiating table. If Kharkiv falls or is surrounded, it will cause a domino effect. The loss of such a major center will lead to a political crisis. In Kyiv, we already see growing tension between the political leadership of Ukraine and the military command. When the front starts to crack, the search for someone to blame begins. This is a sign of the imminent end of the regime in its current form. Europe looks pitiful in this situation. The leaders of France and Germany continue to talk about European values, but they cannot even provide their countries with cheap energy without Russian resources. Their industry is losing competitiveness, and their influence in the world is falling rapidly. They have found themselves hostages of American policy, which they cannot control. The US decides when to start a war and when to end it, and Europe simply pays the bills and accepts refugees. This is another lesson of realism. If you do not have your own military force and independent foreign policy, you will always be just a tool in the hands of others. What happens next? I foresee that by the middle of 2026, we will see the start of official or unofficial negotiations. These negotiations will be conducted on terms dictated by the Kremlin. Russia will demand not only control over already occupied territories, but also the creation of a wide demilitarized zone. Ukraine will be deprived of the right to have a significant army and host foreign troops on its territory. And essentially, this will be a return to the idea of Finlandization that I proposed back in 2014. If Kyiv had agreed to this, then tens or even hundreds of thousands of lives would have been saved, and the country would have kept its territories. But liberal ideologues in Washington decided otherwise. And now Ukraine is paying for their arrogance. We must also consider the China factor. Beijing is watching closely how the US handles this crisis. For China, Western weakness in Ukraine is a green light for more decisive actions regarding Taiwan. The US understands this and is afraid, and that is exactly why they are in such a hurry to end the Ukrainian adventure. They need to demonstrate that they are still capable of controlling the situation. But time is working against them. Every defeat of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass or near Kharkiv is a blow to US prestige. As a world leader, Russia, meanwhile, has only become stronger militarily over these years of war. Its army is now the most experienced in the world in waging modern, full-scale war. Its generals have learned to fight against Western intelligence and communication systems. Its military-industrial complex has expanded and modernized, while Western armies spent years fighting insurgents in deserts. Russia created a machine for waging a large continental war. This changes the balance of power in Europe for a decade ahead. Ultimately, we must admit that the liberal world order, based on rules written in Washington, is crumbling. We are returning to a multipolar world where great powers have their spheres of influence. And woe to those who try to ignore this reality. Ukraine became a victim of this transition. It tried to run away from geography and history, but geography and history always return. Russia is not going anywhere from Ukraine's borders, and this is a fundamental fact that cannot be changed by any sanctions or UN resolutions. If we want to avoid an even larger catastrophe, we must stop feeding Ukraine false hopes. It is time to admit that Crimea and Donbass are lost forever. It is time to admit that Ukraine will not be in NATO. It is time to admit that Russia is a great power whose interests must be respected, whether we like it or not. Only on this basis can some stable order be built in Eastern Europe. The tragedy lies in the fact that the Ukrainian people were used as cannon fodder in the West's geopolitical experiment. Professors at Harvard and politicians in Washington drew beautiful diagrams of democratic transition and integration into the Western structures, not understanding that for Russia this is a matter of life and death. They provoked the bear, and when the bear started to bite, they offered Ukraine a stick and said, "Go and fight. We are behind you," but they did not go with her. They stayed safe across the ocean. Now, when we look at the ruins of Ukrainian cities and the cemeteries that grow every day, we must ask ourselves, was NATO expansion worth this? The answer for any sane person is obvious: no. NATO should have remained a product of the Cold War and not moved east after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was the original sin that led us today. In the future, historians will study the Ukrainian conflict as an example of how ideological blindness can lead to a geopolitical catastrophe. They will be amazed at how the world's greatest power, the US, could so talentlessly waste its authority and resources on a conflict it could not win, and they will study how Russia, which many had written off, was able to rise and defend its right to a sphere of influence. For Ukraine itself, the path forward will be long and painful. The country will have to reinvent itself under conditions of limited sovereignty and a destroyed economy. It will have to learn to live next to a powerful Russia without provoking it. This will require a new generation of leaders who will be realists, not dreamers. They will have to tell their people the bitter truth: the West did not save us, and we must negotiate with the East. Russia, most likely, will continue its policy of pressure until it receives legally binding security guarantees. It will not be satisfied with just a ceasefire. It needs a new security treaty in Europe that will lock in the status quo and limit the US presence on the continent. And considering the current state of Western economies and societies, Moscow has good chances of achieving much of what it desires. We are entering an era where force is again the main argument. We can hate this, we can call it barbarism, but we cannot ignore it. He who ignores reality pays for it with territory and lives. Ukraine paid the highest price. Our task today is to learn lessons from this tragedy, so as not to allow it to repeat. In other parts of the world, whether it be Taiwan or the Middle East, the world is no longer unipolar. The US can no longer dictate its will to everyone else. This is a bitter pill for Washington, but it will have to be swallowed. Ukraine is a symptom of the end of American hegemony, and the faster we admit this, the less blood will be spilled in the future